Amen. You may be seated. I'm going to be dealing with the veil of freedom. And you're going to see why in just a moment. But it's going to be dealing with the veil of freedom. I did a small excerpt at the Martin Luther King. I'm going to do just a little bit. It was part of this entire message. But we're going to start you with this. March 2nd, 1955, I think it was. Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin got on a bus. The bus had blacks on the back and whites in the front. On this bus, Claudette had sat down in her seat immediately behind the white section. The bus became full with white passengers. And when the bus becomes full during that time with white passengers, they were able to tell an African American on the next row get up and move to the back. Now Claudette Colvin sat in one of those seats. And when that happened, everybody on those rows were told to move back, and they did, except for Claudette Colvin. This happened March of 1955, right before the boycott began. Now it was Claudette Colvin that was the first to sit on a bus and was told to move and refused to give up her seat. It was Claudette Colvin that started this whole thing. Now the reason you may not know of Claudette Colvin is because Rosa Parks is the one you've heard of, took her place. See, Rosa was the one that stepped in 9 months later after the event with Claudette Colvin. See, Claudette was arrested, thrown in jail because of what she did. But nobody heard of Claudette Colvin because there were some problems with Claudette. The problems they had with Claudette Colvin was, one, she was dark-skinned. Now, if you read her story, you'll find that when they told Claudette Colvin to stand up, Claudette said she couldn't stand because she felt the weight of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth on her shoulders. She said that was the reason I was unable to stand, because of that. But then Claudette turned out, she was going before, and they said, Claudette, we're going to use you for the movement to progress freedom for everyone and the right to vote. But then they decided not to because Claudette was dark-skinned and her hair wasn't right. And if you read the story, it says that was one of the reasons, but the other was that Claudette was a teenager. And because she was a teenager, they said, we can't use you. Claudette, your skin's not right. Claudette, your hair's not right. Claudette, you're a teenager. And let me tell you, Claudette, you're pregnant out of wedlock. So Claudette, we can't use you in the movement. So Claudette Colvin was cast aside, even though she was the first to start it off. See, Claudette said, I want it, as they began to talk to her and say, hey, will you help us in the movement? Claudette said, I want to help you with change. Claudette told him, I'm prepared for conflict too. And she said that I'm committed to the movement. Claudette Colvin, they set her aside and they said, well, we got to use Rosa Parks. She began to ring the bell of freedom. See, when you ring the bell of freedom, there's some things that have to take place. And let me tell you, when the bell of freedom begins to ring, sometimes we can't stop. That's a train that keeps going. And now it's up to us to now, this generation, you and I now, we are able to ring the bells of freedom. You and I are the bells of freedom that ring nowadays. Claudette was a bell then, you and I are a bell now. So as a bell of freedom, let me tell you some things I'm using this text to bring it out. First, let me tell you, change matters. And I'm going to use this text to show you. Look in verse number 8. He says, in verse 8, we have the children of Israel getting prepared to leave the land. And they had already been gone, and they're now in the Exodus. They're right here, right now. And Joseph had recently died, and he was the one in which everybody knew because he was second highest in the command, in the land. So everybody knew Joseph. But in verse 8, all of a sudden, Joseph died. And the text says a change has taken place. The text says a new king is on the scene. Now this new king, he didn't know Joseph. He wasn't aware of what Joseph had done. He wasn't aware of all the duties that Joseph had done in his life. And now this new king is on the scene. Let me tell you something about racism. Racism is like a chameleon. And racism continues to change. Racism looks and feels differently, but it still exists and thrives. Now in racism, let me explain. Because racism, it started with slavery. That was like in your face, boom, right there. But then you notice how racism began to metamorphose because it then moved from slavery to sharecropping. But it was still racism. It later moved to the Jim Crow laws, where it then became segregation, separating one from another, using black codes to be able to. And if you were a sharecropper back then, if you did not sign to be underneath a laborer, then you were considered a convict and you would be arrested. These were the laws that were placed so that you would be locked down into slavery. So it was another form of racism. But racism didn't stop there. It later changed and metamorphosed into the KKK. It changed again with the new Jim Crow laws. It then moved again, and it says all of a sudden Jim Crow laws came into place, requiring us to be segregated. Racism was showing its face. See, then it changed again, and it took shape into what we would call redlining and separating one from another form of racism. And then it changed again into the drug wars and false imprisonment. And when in New York, the stop and frisk laws, it changed again, another form of racism. Now, if any of us would be asked, does racism, we would all agree it's wrong. We shouldn't do it. You should never, we would say we abhor racism. We find the idea disgusting, but yet it still exists, and it still changes in shapes and forms. This is why, when you have an opportunity to vote, it matters. Because the sheriff matters. Your mayor matters. The governor matters. See, the president, it matters. All of that matters because all of those are forms of change that can take place. And guess what? When those changes take place, racism can be underneath the ground moving. It can be flowing underneath depending on who put in the laws and institutional practices that we have. So it matters when you decide to vote and put in a sheriff or a mayor or a governor or a president. Because they may put laws or institutions that may be considered or against those and certain people. This is what was happening here. Joseph wasn't known anymore. A new king comes on the block. And a new king had new laws, new practices, new institutions, all of that. And yes, the game is rigged. Yes, it's rigged sometimes. I understand. And this is why change matters. It matters. It matters who you elect and who you select. You have to be careful of these things. All of this is part of you ringing the bell of freedom. You can help in instituting these freedom bells to ring. You and I can be some of the people like Claudette Colvin. You and I can do those things. You say, it doesn't the same today. But change is like a river. You know, it was a great rabbi. They said he was on his deathbed and all of the rabbis stood and they wanted to hear from him. They said, we want to hear your last words. And he said, life is like a river. He told that to the rabbi that was closest to him while he was on his deathbed. The other rabbi turned and whispered it, life is like a river. And it turned down, everybody telling him. life is like a river, one rabbi after another. And he got to a seminary student on the very end. And he said, life is like a river. He turned and he said, well, what does that mean? The words, what does that mean, came back to the rabbi who was on his deathbed. And the rabbi said, he said, it means life is not like a river. Life is not like a river. I had trouble trying to decipher it. And then I remembered, anytime you step into a river, you never step into the water twice because it continues to flow. The thing is that in the life of your river, the life that you have to find a constant. You have to find something to hold on to when life moves you about. And that constant that you and I would have to hold on to is God. God is our constant. God is the very thing that you and I have to hold on when life changes. And life has its twist and turn. Life continues to move you down. And guess what? Life changes. And as life changes, you and I need a constant. And that constant is God. So the bell of freedom rings. Yes, change matters. You and I, when change matters, it doesn't matter what happens. But you and I will end up holding on to God when change occurs. Life is the bell of freedom. Your life is the bell of freedom. Change matters. But let me tell you, also conflict matters. Look what he says in the text. He says in verse 9, he said to the people, he said, behold, the people, the sons of Israel are mightier. And he says, come, let us deal wisely with them, else they will multiply in the event of war, that they would join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us. See, the king started thinking. The king said, there's a lot of them out there. It's a whole bunch of them. And he says, the problem is if they decide to rise up against us, we've got to be able to do something. And he says, what they may do, he says, the text says that they may turn and join to someone else, an enemy that hates us. And if they join to the enemy that hates us, then all of a sudden they would begin to take power. They would take control of the land. And the king says, I've got to stop this because they are the dominant culture. And so the king says, we've got to do something about them. Let me tell you, racism is rooted in fear. Every time. One power wanted to take power from another, which was the dominant culture at that time. So the king then became afraid, and what he began to do is says, we've got to do something about those people. The king said, the problem is there are too many. It's a lot of them. And because it's a lot of them, we got to do something with them. And so then he began to think of things. He says, I can't let them join in because if they do, they will strip the power from me. And the king says, I cannot be stripped of my power. Rooted in fear. The king wanted to stay in power. Listen what else he says. He says in verse 10, he says, let us deal wisely with them. And then he says, after they dealt wisely, he appointed taskmasters, and their goal was to afflict them with very much pain. And he says in verse 10, he says they were going to give them hard labor. And in verse 13, the Egyptians compelled them to, yes, give them hard labor. And in verse 14, he says they're going to make their lives bitter. They're going to whip and they're going to beat them. They're going to put them under hard labor. They're going to sit them to mortar and bricks. And he says, in all of this, in the fields of labor, all of this was to be imposed upon them. That's what the text says. You see, racism is rooted in financial gain. Because they said, listen, what we'll do is we'll put them in slavery so that then they can become the ones who build our cities. And they were the ones who built, he says, the Pythium and Ramses. He says, they're the ones who built that. He says that we're going to put them to labor so that we can use that labor force as our own financial gain. The king was thinking. He says, we gotta create some type of story about them and create some storyline that somehow that they are inferior to us. This is what the king was saying. So that I could put them under my task. Make them work for me. So he had to create storylines as if they were not able to take care of their children. Storylines that they were not fully human. Storylines in which they were only good for music, song, and dance, and this is what they did for the king. Storylines that they were only laborers and nothing else, that they couldn't think for themselves. These are the storylines the king had to create so that he would be able to keep them in a state of hopelessness and despair. And so because of that, he says we're going to keep them oppressed. But here's the thing. God is working for the oppressed. He is. That's what God does. Psalms 9:9 says the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed. And he says a stronghold in times, he says, of conflict, in times of trouble. He said that's when God decides to show up. That's when God begins to reveal himself. When the conflict is there and it begins to press into your life, he said that's when God decides to show himself strong. Amen. That's when he decides to show himself mighty. But let me tell you, with this conflict that is going on, look at one of the verses here. He says in verse number 12, he says, but one thing is that they were more afflicted. He says, then he says, what happened was they multiplied. Verse 12 said, they spread. He says, even though they began to be afflicted more and more, the text says what happened was they spread out, they multiplied, they grew mightier in number, more and more. See, you can take away somebody's freedom, but you can't take away God's favor. See, when God has favor upon you, nobody, no devil in hell, nothing can stop the favor of God. Cannot do it. Amen. You may feel oppressed, you may realize that you're in conflict, and you may find yourself in situations in which you cannot even fathom. But if God's favor is upon you, guess what? You're going to be a bell of freedom in the midst of conflict. Right in the middle of it. You will ring out freedom every time. Because no matter what, I can't explain it, but you cannot stop when God's favor is poured out upon you. Can't stop it. Can't stop it. And see, they tried everything. The king said, I'm going to try everything to get them under my task and be my taskmasters. All of that. He says, none of that worked. Matter of fact, they began to multiply. The text says they grew and grew and they got bigger and bigger. He says all of that because underneath all of that conflict was the favor of God that's constantly working. So yes, you may have conflict in your life. That's true. The river may be flowing. That's true. To hold on to God when change is going on because God is working underneath. And he's working out for your favor. See, this is what this text reminds me of. But not only that, he said, change matters when the bell of freedom rings. Conflict matters, but also commitment. Commitment. Look in verse 15. He said, then the king of Egypt, he says, what happened was he spoke to the Hebrew wives and he turned to them and he says, I've got to really do something about all of this that's going on. I've got this new change in place. Joseph's dead. I'm now the new king. I've been trying to get rid of all these people. I see them multiplying. I put out storylines. I put out taskmasters. They continue to get more and more. He says, I'm getting a problem here and we've got to do something. I got a new plan. And my new plan is that I'm going to my Hebrew wives. I'm going to go to them. And matter of fact, I'm going to go to every Egyptian that is around and every Hebrew. And I'm going to put out an edict. And my edict says that if you find a little boy, kill him. I want you to throw him in the Nile. It says that's what I need you to do. You see, they were trying themselves to say, okay, I can't get to him one way, I'm going to get to him another. And they had this edict, and so you were then, even if you were Egyptian, were to throw the baby in the Nile. You got to hold on, hold on, hold on. Even if you were Egyptian, you were to throw the baby in the Nile. Even if you were Egyptian, you're to throw the baby in the Nile. He started with the Hebrew midwives. He told them when they give out labor, girl, let it live. Boy, kill it. Hebrew midwives, they begin to do this thing, and it says in the text what happens is, but the midwives feared God. See, the midwives wasn't committed to the edict that the king put out. No, they were committed to God. See, no matter what happens in your life, you got to find yourself being committed to God. No matter what you're being told, if they tell you to do something that is outside of the will of God, you got to find yourself committed to God. That's what you need to find, because committed to God equals obedience. That means you have decided to live your life under the umbrella of God and following the rules and regulations that God has laid out for you. And these Hebrew midwives, one of the things they were committed to is that they were committed to God and not people. And if you find yourself committed to people, you're locked into the wrong thing. You cannot commit to people. You commit to God. That's who you serve. That's who you follow. That's the one that should be premium in your life and first place in your life. It should be God. So he finds himself and he says, listen, I need you guys to kill all of the babies. And then the thing that happens is it always occurs this way, is you gotta get to the boys. You gotta get to the boys. If you want to wipe out a race, you gotta get to the boys. It can't be, it's not done through the girls. It's done through the boys. Because you get rid of the boys, you get rid of the race. His whole plan was, I'm going to get rid of the race. And he was going to do it through the boys. Because he understood you compromise. You understand, you compromise the family through the boys. You get rid of the man, compromise the family. You get rid of the man, you compromise the community. And he understood this. And this exactly was his plan. This was the plan that he had in place that he wanted to do. He was getting ready to rob the race. See, listen, you're going to go out to your jobs. And you have an opportunity now to be committed to the bell of freedom. You're going to be working in your jobs, and you can, right where you are, stand up against these injustices. Things that may take place that are not right. Inequalities, you can stand up against them right where you are and be a bell of freedom. But you have to be committed to God. Committed to God no matter what the situation is. Because in this story, we find out that when Moses was placed in the Nile in a basket and floated down the river, who picked him up? An Egyptian. The edict was you're supposed to kill him. Drown him in the Nile. But this Egyptian woman looked in the basket. She didn't see color or race. She just saw a baby that's in need. She reached in, picked him up, brought him into the palace, and raised him there. And that can only be God. That can only be the way that God works in the life of people. Amen. See, he was going to use Moses later to be the bell of freedom for all of those people to be able to walk out. Later, he becomes that bell of freedom that everybody follows as they begin to march out of Egypt. See, God knows what he's doing. And it may not look like it. It may look like the enemy's winning and he's taking over. But if you have to stay committed to God. And if you stay committed to God, God will work everything out in your life. God will work it out to your favor. Change matters, conflict matters, commitment matters. All of that matters in your life when you decide, hey, I'm going to live for God. Let me tell you this. My wife and I and our children, we went to Philadelphia. You know, we traveled to Philadelphia. And while in Philadelphia, I was telling a story that we got to see the love sign. You know the love sign, the L-O-V-E with the O leaning to the right. You've seen it. That's in Philadelphia. Matter of fact, we got to see the steps in which Rocky ran up, and he got to see his little statue of him. You guys remember Rocky, the story? He's in Philadelphia. But we also got to see, here's what we also got to see. We got to see the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell used to hang in the halls of Philadelphia, the state court. And it used to ring. The thing is about the Liberty Bell, it began to show cracks in it. It's ironic because it was the Liberty Bell that was ringing in the Declaration of Independence. It was the Liberty Bell that rang. And you know, inscribed on the Liberty Bell is to tell you to have freedom to all throughout the land. You know where that comes from? That comes from Leviticus 25 and 10. It says that you should have freedom to all those without the land. That's what the Liberty Bell says. But if you look at it, it's stripped of its context. It's stripped of its meaning. Well, how do you know that? Because if you were to read 25 and 10, in which it received its inscription, let me read it to you. Leviticus 25 and 10, it reads as follows. It says, you shall consecrate the 50th year. And he says, and proclaim a release throughout the land. Freedom throughout the land. But it says to all its inhabitants. And then it says, it shall be what? A jubilee for you. And each of you return your own property to each man, and each man returns to his own family. See, God meant that as a year in which everybody would be free. Every slave. And he meant that as a year in which all of your debts were canceled. And the reason is because he didn't want you to live in perpetual poverty. And that was inscribed upon the Liberty Bell, but stripped of its context. Because when the Liberty Bell received this inscription, slavery was alive and well. It was going strong. So it wasn't meant for everybody to be free. It was only meant for a certain few. The Liberty Bell wasn't there for everybody. And that's why it was written this way on it. But the funny thing is, cracks began to show it. Cracks, and they began to show, and it was beginning to be beyond repair. Matter of fact, it was in the day of George Washington's birthday. On his birthday, they rang the Liberty Bell morning till night. And when they rang it, see, the cracks then began to show up, and they were beyond repair. They said, we can't fix the cracks anymore in the Liberty Bell, is what you see today. And since that time, the bell has never rung. The bell doesn't sound for freedom anymore. Doesn't ring at all. Because it has this crack that's there. See, you and I are the bell of freedom now. That's what you and I are. See, but if you have a crack, you won't sound. You won't make a noise. There'll be nothing for you to do. You can't ring for injustice. You can't ring for inequality. You can't ring for freedom. See, because you're cracked. See, but if we serve God, and if we belong to God, we serve an almighty God who doesn't see race, who doesn't see inequality, who treats everybody the same. That's how you and I should ring. That's how a bell should sound. So when we go to our places that we go, and when we see injustice, we see inequality, we see times in which that freedom is being stripped of people, you and I should ring. You and I should be the bell of freedom. Clanging back and forth. Everybody's hearing our sound. The sound that we make, which is because God is in our life. And because God wants everybody free, we want everybody free. Amen. You believe it, say amen.
Amen. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the sermon and encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There, you will receive even more encouraging words from Pastor Tim. Remember, in addition to the videos, with a simple registration, you can receive the Life Notes. Pastor's outline and scripture references for his sermons will come directly to your inbox each week. Thank you again for watching. You are always invited to attend our morning worship services every Sunday morning starting at 10 a.m. Bible studies are Wednesday evenings starting at 6:30. You've been listening to Pastor Timothy Jones of Rockbridge Church, Allen, Texas, where we follow the Go MC mission. God others, ministry, and community.